Good evening. Welcome to the annual Bechtel Lectures in Anabaptist-Mennonite Studies. I am Lorene Hardy-Gissing. I'm Archivist Librarian at Conrad Grebel, and I'm the Director of the Institute of Anabaptist-Mennonite Studies. And I am hosting this year's lectures, which I think mostly means briefly setting the stage and then getting out of the way so that you could enjoy the rich and varied insights from our lecturer, Dr. David Weaver-Zercher, as well as other participants over the next 2 evenings. I want to acknowledge with deep gratitude the Bechtel family for making these lectures possible. In the year 2000, Lester Bechtel, churchman, businessman, and lover of all things Mennonite, provided a gift to the college which would allow us to offer annual lectures to nurture understanding of the Anabaptist-Mennonite faith and tradition. The lectures have been offered every year since then, and on a wide range of topics. We have hosted historians, theologians, scientists, creative writers, among others. We thank you, Lester, and your family, for creating this opportunity for the college and community. Lester, why don't you please stand so we can acknowledge you. I warned him I was going to do that. So as you might imagine, there are many details that go into the planning of a lecture series. When it came time to choosing an image for the poster, I knew it had to be one of Jan Luygen's incredible etchings from the Martyrs Mirror. But there are over 100 of these etchings. Which one to choose? Well, this is the one I chose. In this image, we see the martyrdom of bookseller Jorian Simons and a companion who were imprisoned, tortured, and burned at the stake for their faith. The Martyrs Mirror tells us that when, on the 26th of April 1557, they were brought forth to death, the common people greatly commiserated with them. But they said, "Weep not for us, but for your sins, and repent truly." The account goes on to say that when the authorities had finished their tyranny by strangling and burning, they, in order to quench their doctrine, also thought to burn their books. But when the books were perceived to be on fire, there arose such an uproar among the people that the lords took flight, whereupon the books were thrown among the multitude, who reached for them with eagerness, so that through divine providence the truth, instead of being quenched, was spread the more by the reading of so great a number of books. Here is a scene that has played out so often in human history, and sadly still plays out today, wherever war creates not only human casualties, but the destruction of ideas, heritage, and culture. The columns of smoke in this scene are, I think, doubly ominous, mingling the destruction of human life with the silencing of stories. Yet there is hope here too, as the bystanders shake off their fears and rescue words from the fire. As a librarian and archivist, this illustration moves me deeply, especially as this week is being celebrated in Canada as Freedom to Read Week. So, which illustration would you have chosen? Is there a Martyrs Mirror story that is particularly meaningful to you? I ask because these questions get at a central theme of our Bechtel lecturer tonight, David Weaver-Zercher, and his book Martyrs Mirror, A Social History. There are many fascinating details in this book describing how the Martyrs Mirror came to be, how it was compiled and printed and distributed. But in this book, David also helps us to understand the readers of the Martyrs Mirror. how has the Martyrs Mirror shaped Anabaptist life and thought over 4 centuries? And what parts of our own lives and experiences, how do they shape how we read these stories and interpret these pictures? So a bit about our lecturer tonight. David Weaver-Zercher is Distinguished Professor of American Religious History at Messiah College, a college founded by the Brethren in Christ in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. And in case you are wondering, yes, he is married to Valerie Weaver-Zercher, author of the book Thrill of the Chaste, The Allure of Amish Romance Novels. I know some of you have read it, even if you don't want to admit it, you have. David has published widely on various aspects of Amish and Mennonite life, with a particular interest in issues of representation and communication. His books on Amish life include The Amish in the American Imagination, The Amish in the Media, and Amish Grace, How Forgiveness Transcended Tragedy. After the tragic shooting at an Amish school at Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania in 2006, he was often called upon by the news media. And perhaps we'll hear more about that side of his work tomorrow, when our topic is Mennonites and the media. But tonight, we have asked David to speak to us on the theme of his most recent book, Martyrs Mirror Social History. Following his talk, we will have time for some questions, and then there will be a special musical performance that I will introduce later. After this, you are invited upstairs for a reception and a special Martyrs Mirror exhibit. But for now, please join me in welcoming to the stage our 2018 Bechtel Lecturer, Dr. David Weaver-Zercher.
Well, thanks, Lorene, for that kind introduction. Thanks to the organizers of this event for inviting me to speak. I've followed the Bechtel Lectures from afar, mostly through Mennonite World Review, although I've used some pieces published out of it in classes. And I've always been impressed by the list of speakers that have been Bechtel Lecturers, and I can now say I'm on that list. So I'm pretty happy about that. My talk this evening is about Martyrs Mirror, the 17th century Anabaptist martyr book compiled by the Dutch Mennonite minister Tieleman van Braght and published in 1660. As you heard in Lorene's introduction, I recently published a history of Martyrs Mirror that looks at a lot of different things with a particular interest in the reception of it. How are people reading it? Why are people reading it? How are they encountering it? One thing that I didn't explore at length in my book, but which caught my attention time and again as I was writing it, was the lingering presence of teenagers in my sources. Not so much their voices, but the concern for them in the voices of those who sought to multiply the book's influence. That is, publishers, church leaders, and ministers. These proponents of Martyrs Mirror sometimes wanted young people to buy the book, but if not that, to at least read the book, or if not that, at least to listen to other people as they talked about the book. That was true in the 18th century, it was true in the 19th century, it was true in the 20th century, and in the 21st century, and we'll spend most of our time in the 20th and 21st century tonight. The hopes for the book, expressed by mature adults, people of my age, frequently fixed on teenagers who were coming of age. Now, this evening I want to explore that reality, partly because I wonder about it. I wonder about that as a strategy for the retention of young people. Why, we might ask, if we really want our children to embrace our brand of the Christian faith, why would we go out of our way to remind them that the people who embrace it get hunted down, tortured, and killed, strung up like this guy? Is that really a helpful thing to be telling teenagers who are sorting out their religious identities? Now, in the course of asking that question this evening, and I'll say up front, I don't have a clear answer to that question, I consider what one scholar of youth ministries, Kenda Creasy-Dean, calls an invitation to oddity, which in her view is an important tool for inviting adolescent commitments to Christ in the church. Is the use of Martyrs Mirror among teenagers an invitation to oddity? Or is it just odd? I'll begin my consideration of those questions with one of my favorite research finds. A one-page article that was published in 1950 in a Mennonite church publication called The Youth's Christian Companion. And here's a bad picture of that periodical. The piece was written by Gerald Studer, an aspiring Mennonite minister. The article announced the reprinting of Martyrs Mirror by the Mennonite Publishing House in Scottdale, Pennsylvania. The audience for this particular periodical, the Youth's Christian Companion, was Mennonite church youth in their late teens and early 20s. And the article he wrote carried a title that represented a bold assumption about these young people's finances. And here it is. You can afford a Martyr's Mirror. Now, if you think that title sounds more like a marketing pitch than a book review, you would be right. Which makes a lot of sense given that both Martyrs Mirror and the periodical that carried the piece, Youth Christian Companion, were published by the Mennonite Publishing House. Here's one paragraph of Studer's piece that continues in that hard sell mode. Attention, everybody, and especially Mennonite youth. The Martyrs Mirror has been reprinted and is again available from our publishing house in Scottdale. Order yours now so that you don't miss it. Confident that his 2 exclamation points had gotten his readers' attention, Studer proceeded to offer a few teasers for Martyrs Mirror. Here's one, and again I'll show you a quote directly from his article. If you buy a Martyrs Mirror, he wrote, you will read of a 16-year-old girl whose youth and beauty stirred such pity that all begged that her life be saved. But she would not recant. So the executioner carried her in his arms to a horse trough and held her under water until she was dead, then laid her lifeless body on the flames. It's probably not too surprising that for this particular audience, Studer teased his potential buyers with the story of a teenager. In fact, he followed this particular story, this particular teaser, by summarizing 3 other accounts from Martyrs Mirror that included teenagers or young adults. But this story of a 16-year-old girl is most interesting to me for 3 reasons. First, Studer takes time to tell his readers that this 16-year-old girl was beautiful. A beauty that, in his retelling at least, made it all the more awful to her contemporaries that she was being executed. Second, Studer takes care to emphasize the gruesomeness of her death. First, she was held under water in a horse trough, and then her lifeless body was laid on the flames. Third, and this is what I find most interesting of all. While the story of this teenage girl can be found in a few Mennonite historical sources, it doesn't actually appear in Martyrs Mirror. In other words, this particular teaser was, shall we say, false advertising in the service of selling books. And the fact that this story is used as false advertising, the fact that the account doesn't actually appear in Martyrs Mirror, redoubles my interest in the things that Studer chose to highlight. This teenager's physical beauty, the compassion her beauty stirred in her contemporaries, and the gruesomeness of her death. All this for the sake of selling books strikes me as rather inappropriate, if not perverse. Though, as anyone with a marketing degree can tell you, titillation is often effective when selling a product. I suspect that Studer saw this particular story as one that would stir the passions of his potential buyers, particularly young male buyers, as they imagined both the girl's physical beauty and the gruesomeness of her death. Today we have teenage horror flicks. In the 1950s, Studer had Martyrs Mirror. And once he had tapped into those heightened passions, he sought to use them in service of the church, reminding his readers of the story's significance. In his words, this story proved, and I'll quote it again from his article again, that the Mennonite church has been founded and kept going by the lives and deaths of young people. This claim has some historic validity. Some of the Anabaptist martyrs were indeed quite young, and no doubt their brave witness has inspired some people to maintain their faith in trying times. But the more meaningful component of Studer's claim, the more historically meaningful component, is the fact that the Mennonite church, like most religious entities in human history, has been kept going by the lives of young people. That is, the survival of Anabaptism over the centuries, at least in North America, has mostly hinged upon the willingness of unpersecuted Anabaptist teens to embrace the faith of their mothers and fathers. To paraphrase the theologian Stanley Hauerwas, North American Mennonites may think of themselves as a believer's church where there's no such thing as a second-generation Christian. But the fact remains that most North American Mennonites, through much of the 20th century, had names like Yoder and Landis and Lapp and Friesen and Reimer and Penner. In other words, they were the children, literally the children of Mennonites who embraced their parents' faith. The fear of the next generation dispossessing their parents' faith is not unique among Anabaptists, but the fear is particularly intense among religious people whose commitments run counter to widely accepted cultural norms. Not only is the hurdle of converting outsiders to your cause a bigger hurdle to surmount, but the temptation for the next generation to leave their parents' countercultural faith is stronger when there's social status to be gained by letting it go. For Mennonites, this perceived gain of status has been particularly acute in times of war, when friends and neighbors, one's teenage friends and neighbors, are heading off to fight for a sacred cause. The sponsors of the first North American Martyrs Mirror articulated this quandary well. In 1745, a group of Mennonite ministers north of Philadelphia wrote a letter to Dutch Mennonite leaders in the Netherlands, asking them for help in translating and producing a German-language version of Martyrs Mirror, an edition that was eventually produced in this little print shop at the Ephrata Cloisters in Ephrata, Pennsylvania. To this point in time, the only editions of Martyrs Mirror were in the Dutch language, and many New World Mennonites could not read Dutch. But the more particular impetus for this request was the cultural milieu in which these Mennonites found themselves. In the 1740s, the conflict between England and Spain and France had reached North America. And English authorities were urging the colonies to contribute money and, in some cases, men to the war effort. This is what they wrote to their Dutch colleagues. The flames of war seem to be mounting higher and higher, so high that cross and tribulation may soon fall to the non-resistant Christian. It's time, they said, to make every preparation for the steadfast constancy of our faith, which to them meant printing Martyrs Mirror. In this particular case, then, the countercultural practice under threat was the Anabaptist commitment to non-resistance. And the letter writer's assumption was that Martyrs Mirror, a book filled with non-resistant Christians holding fast to their non-resistant faith, their hope was that could inspire North American Mennonites, young men, to maintain their non-resistant faith. If we read their letter more closely, that's who they were focusing on: Mennonite youth, who had grown up in North America and who in the future would be tempted to abandon their Mennonite commitments. These young men had come of age in an environment that was largely tolerant of Mennonites, much more tolerant than the lands from which their parents and grandparents had come. In the early 20th century, Richard Niebuhr, in his classic work, The Social Sources of Denominationalism, wrote this: "Rarely does the second generation hold convictions it has inherited with a fervor equal to that of its fathers, who fashioned these convictions in the heat of conflict and at the risk of martyrdom." It appears that this had been true of the Mennonites north of Philadelphia, where the young people, the young men, had not fashioned the conviction of non-resistance as much as they had inherited it. The question then, and it's a question for all religious people in pluralistic religious environments, is to how to get your children to embrace the faith of their fathers and mothers when there are other options available to them. And to put a more Mennonite spin on that question, how do you get your children to embrace the faith of their fathers and mothers when there are other Christian options out there that don't demand such a countercultural stance? Maybe the answer is to have them sing. Another worthy means to stir the passions of youth, of all people, but of youth. Jumping back now to Studer's piece in the 1950s, I find it interesting that he takes time to quote from the famous persecution hymn, Faith of Our Fathers, the hymn that begins with these words: "Faith of our fathers, living still, in spite of dungeon, fire, and sword." Studer doesn't quote those words, however, but skips to the hymn's second verse, where he quotes these words instead: "How sweet would be their children's fate if they, like them, could die for thee." Perhaps these two lines from Faith of Our Fathers illustrate what my friend Doug Curry often says about Christian hymnody. Doug is a music and worship professor at Messiah College, where I teach, and he tells his students, many of whom are writing hymn themselves, that when people become Christians, they stop telling lies and start singing them. Is persecution really a sweet fate? Or is that singing a lie? Whatever it is, one has to wonder if the hymn's references to our fathers, and in its most recent renderings, our mothers, whether those references are mostly a reminder to teenagers of just how disappointed their actual parents will be if they abandon the faith that their parents sought to instill in them from birth. So let me wrap up this section of my talk by showing you a verse of the hymn, Faith of Our Mothers, written by A.B. Patton around 1920. "Faith of our mothers, living yet, in cradle song and bedtime prayer, in nursery love and fireside love, thy presence still pervades the air. Faith of our mothers, living faith, we will be true to thee till death." If you've ever thought about leaving your mother's faith, just take time to meditate on these words. Should stop you in your tracks. Though perhaps more pertinent to our consideration of adolescence would be the third verse of Patton's hymn. Faith of our mothers, guiding faith, for youthful longing, youthful doubt. How blurred our vision, blind our way, thy providential care, without thy providential care. Faith of our mothers, guiding faith, we will be true to thee till death. Now again, this may be singing a lie. Or perhaps we should be less cynical and call it aspirational singing. An observation I use to introduce the next section of my talk, which is a brief look at the problem of denominational loyalty. And I need to be upfront that these observations are based on surveys conducted in the United States. That's what I'm familiar with, though I suspect much of the same is true, at least for parts of Canada, though maybe not quite as true. But at least in the United States, it's very clear that denominational loyalty is on the decline. This is even true for people who are highly religious. This trend has been ongoing and accelerating since the 1950s. Smaller families, greater geographical mobility, higher rates of education, higher rates of interreligious marriage, increased cooperation of parachurch organizations. There's just a host of factors that have conspired against denominational loyalty. The 2015 Pew Forum Landscape Survey of 30,000 Americans reveals the extent of this reality. This published report devotes an entire chapter, one of its first chapters, to religious switching. A chapter that leads with this observation. Even if Protestantism is treated as a single religious group, fully 34% of American adults currently have a religious identity different from the one in which they were raised. If we drill down deeper to particular Protestant families like Presbyterians or Baptists, the percentage of switchers rises higher, revealing that less than half of Americans still identify with the denominational family in which they were raised. The Pew numbers are a little better for Anabaptist churches, but there's plenty of evidence out there that denominational loyalty is on the wane among Mennonites. For instance, in this 2006 survey of the Mennonite Church USA, we found that 34% of Mennonite church members said they were strongly committed to the denomination. But almost as many agreed that church denominations do not matter much to me. One is as good as another. Correspondingly, nearly half of the church members surveyed in 2006 agreed that too much emphasis on Mennonite beliefs get in the way of the true message of the gospel. And only 8% agreed with the comment that Mennonite teachings more accurately reflect the Word of God than the teachings of other denominations. That last question is an interesting one to consider. It doesn't ask respondents whether they think Mennonites follow Jesus more consistently than other Christians. It doesn't ask whether they think Mennonites are God's chosen people or whether Mennonites are more faithful. It simply asks whether Mennonite teachings more accurately reflect the Word of God. And the overwhelming response in 2006 was no. You can decide for yourself whether you like that answer or not. But the point I want to make this evening is that this particular response doesn't align very closely with the aspirational claims we find in Faith of Our Fathers, Faith of Our Mothers. Why would you strive to be true to the faith of your parents if you don't think that faith is somehow superior to the faith of other people's parents? There is one answer to this question, of course, and that's a broadening out of what it means to be true to your mother's and father's faith. Perhaps in an era of declining denominational loyalty, faithfulness to our mothers and fathers is being true to some least common denominator Christianity that children can locate in their parents' lives, not the more unique countercultural aspects of their parents' Mennonite faith, but rather the components that are widely shared with many Christians who claim the name of Christ. This sort of sanded down, flattened out Christianity, however, is not what they were thinking about at Churchtown Mennonite Church, which I visited a few years ago. At Churchtown Mennonite Church, located in this unadorned brick meeting house south of Harrisburg, churchgoers are able to sing the first two verses of Faith of Our Fathers. They can sing the first two verses by memory. This is exactly what they did the Sunday afternoon service I attended 5 years ago. Service populated by Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonites from a number of local congregations. They called this 2-hour service their annual Bible meeting. But in this particular afternoon, the biblical text was not used very much. It wasn't used nearly as much as Martyrs Mirror. Churchtown Mennonite Church is a congregation in the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite Church, a conference of about 60 Mennonite congregations that came into existence in 1969, when a number of congregations left Lancaster Mennonite Conference because, in their view, Lancaster Mennonite Conference was becoming too liberal, particularly in the area of dress. At the service I attended, there were a number of Eastern Mennonite Church congregations there. The men, as is customary in the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite Church, the men and the boys sat on one side of the sanctuary. The women and the girls sat on the other. Though in this particular meeting, the teenagers sat with their peers in front of the main seating area, the boys on the left and the girls on the right. The entire focus of this 2-hour gathering was Martyrs Mirror, with spoken prayers, congregational hymns, and 2 45-minute sermons, all aimed at helping those in attendance encounter the book's message. There's much I could say about this particular presentation of Martyrs Mirror, but for our purposes this evening, the most significant element was the priority given to adolescents in this meeting. Again, the teenagers sat together in a strategic location, not only close to the minister's lectern, but also in full view of the congregation. And you can imagine the girls sitting here facing me, and the boys sitting there facing me, and all of you sitting there facing this way. In the course of the 2 sermons, the preachers returned time and again to stories of teenage martyrs, sometimes mentioning them generally, but more often talking about specific adolescents in the book, and this actually is in Martyrs Mirror. The teenager Eulalia, who, quote, not more than 13 years old, was filled with such ardor of the Spirit to die in the name of Christ. In one case, preacher Clifford Martin told of a 14-year-old boy who was favored by the Roman emperor until he refused to pay homage to the Roman gods, at which point the boy was threatened with decapitation. Turning straight away to his adolescent listeners, Martin asked them this, and again I quote, "Youth here this afternoon, would you be able to defend your faith as this 14-year-old boy did?" Martin quickly conceded that everyone in attendance, regardless of their age, should ponder the teenager's witness. But by the choice of his and his fellow preachers' examples, the focus of the afternoon was clearly on the youth. And just what message did they want the young people to imbibe? As you'd expect, the preachers frequently touched on the theme of holding fast to the faith in adverse circumstances. At one point, one of the ministers raised the hypothetical question that Martyrs' books inevitably raise, namely, what would you do in the face of persecution? More significantly, though, these conservative ministers pointed to more subtle dangers to their teenagers' faith. including the danger of abandoning church-sanctioned forms of nonconformity. And again, I quote from one of the ministers, "How do you prepare yourself to face the enemy who wants to wreck your faith through more gentle means than martyrdom?" The preachers did not leave the application of their message to chance, but instead identified the applications directly: carrying cell phones, accumulating material possessions, nursing anger, and more generally, running after anything that, quote, the church forbids. All these things were cited as instances of falling prey to the enemy that was more subtle than martyrdom. In other words, these preachers used Martyrs Mirror that day to reinforce nonconformity, a reinforcement that in their view was aided and abetted by the bloody stories of the generations that had come before. In her book, Choosing Church, What Makes a Difference for Teens, educator Carol Litch argues that socialization into a particular faith is rarely enough to capture the hearts of youth who have a choice whether to embrace the church of their parents or not. According to Litch, youth also need powerful emotional experiences that in many cases they later interpret as an encounter with God. These experiences, says Litch, are more likely to occur when the regular rhythms and rituals of religious life are disrupted, which is exactly what I witnessed in that afternoon Bible meeting. This was no ordinary time in the life of an Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite young person. Rather, these teenagers found them in a packed auditorium, seated in front of a congregation, in full view of their parents and grandparents, surrounded by their close friends, staring across the platform at marriageable young people of the opposite sex. Literally speaking, they were being set up to hear the stories of people their age who had been willing to give up their lives for the sake of Jesus. In the coming years, many of these same youth will attend what the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonites call Winter Bible School, a 3-week college-like experience that once again brings together young single adults for fellowship and learning. These Bible schools are prime settings for meeting potential spouses. And it's not surprising that one of the more frequent course offerings at the Bible school is on the topic of creating a Christian home. But neither is it surprising that another course at the Bible school focuses on Martyrs Mirror, giving those in attendance the chance to ponder these heart-wrenching stories of Anabaptist martyrs who went before them. Given the relatively privileged standing of contemporary North American Mennonites, including those in the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonite Conference, outsiders may wonder about the strong emphasis placed on the Anabaptist martyrs, and it is very strong. For the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonites, however, these martyrs are truly the fathers and mothers of their specific form of Christianity. A form that, again, they truly believe is superior to other forms. A recently published history of the conference carries the name Keeping the Trust. And the introduction notes that the book's purpose is to help, quote, the rising generation value the steps by which God has led us to where we are today, unquote. The primary theme in the book, signified by its title, is the spiritual decline of other North American Mennonites, especially in the 1950s and 1960s when, according to the author Kenneth Walker, and again I quote, the majority of North American Mennonites were swept along in an avalanche of apostasy. Thankfully, the Eastern Pennsylvania Mennonites came along to rescue time-proven biblical principles that were being jettisoned by Mennonite congregations like the one I attend, which is about 5 miles from Churchtown Mennonite Church, where we sit in mixed gender seating on a Sunday morning, where we wear modern clothes, including cloth jewelry, and pursue college educations. This act of rescue, the book jacket notes, was clearly a mandate they received from God, a sacred trust, reaching down through the years to us today. You can decide for yourself whether you appreciate that level of theological certitude, or whether you find it problematic or even off-putting. If you happen to find it problematic, it may mean that you're a member of a Mennonite conference or congregation in which it's more difficult to know what to do with Martyrs Mirror. In fact, a congregation that may be wary about using it with adolescents. There are, of course, stories to be told of assimilated Mennonite congregations that do introduce their young people to Martyrs Mirror. In some cases, that introduction means little more than showing off some of the book's images that depict torture and execution. Pictures such as this, or this, or this. Regaling impressionable youth with Jan Lyken's pictures has been criticized in more than a few quarters. In one particularly provocative critique, Stephanie Grebel recalls a Sunday school class in which she, as a 14-year-old girl, was introduced to the finer points of torture through a review of Jan Lyken images. Looking back on that experience as an adult, Grebel noted that the message she imbibed that day was, quote, "Our beliefs invite painful death, and the good Christian should give such deaths, quote, a rapturous welcome," lessons she was unhappy to have received, and therefore happy to discard. As the father of a sensitive 13-year-old boy myself, whose threshold of fear is very low, and whose conscience is quite sensitive, I sympathize with that critique. The Sunday school lesson that she endured strikes me as an example of what one of my colleagues at Messiah College calls shock and awe pedagogy, a strategy used by second-rate teachers who lack more skillful means of maintaining their students' attention. If your only goal as a teacher is to keep your students from getting bored, shock and awe is a good strategy. But like the shock and awe of an Air Force bombing, this approach often results in the destruction of tender souls. Still, even these shock and awe teachers are on to something. In his classic discussion of youth identity formation, Identity, Youth, and Crisis, Erik Erikson argues that adolescents are looking for something, and these are his words, to die for. It's hard to tell whether Erikson wants his readers to interpret that literally, for he quickly goes on to say that fidelity is what drives young people. That is, what really drives adolescence is the search, and again, these are a quote from his book, a search for something and somebody to be true to. Search for somebody and something to be true to. Kenda Creasy Dean, who teaches youth ministry at Princeton Theological Seminary, picks up on Erikson's identity theory in her book, Practicing Passion, noting the fascination that young people have with martyr narratives. pointing to a few examples in recent American history, including the story of a young girl killed in the Columbine school shooting. Dean writes that for adolescents, the life of the martyr fascinates adolescents. Not because they want to share in the martyr's grisly suffering, but because they envy their passion, their purpose, and their brazen determination. According to Dean, young people are too often told that to be an adult in contemporary North America, one needs to abandon their passions, capitulate to compromising half-truths, settle down, and get a good-paying job. What the church really needs to do, if they want spiritually committed teens, says Dean, is foster an invitation to oddity. So we're back at that question I asked at the outset. Can Martyrs Mirror serve as an invitation to oddity, and can it do that in more assimilated Mennonite environments? If Kenda Dean is right, that martyrdom is inherently captivating to young people, can that interest be leveraged in ways that encourage assimilated Mennonite youth to embrace the Anabaptist faith of their fathers and mothers? At least some assimilated Mennonites continue to think so. I'm not sure there are many, but at least some do. A few years ago, the Mennonite Board of Education produced parochial school materials on Martyrs Mirror that introduced junior high and high school students to Martyrs Mirror. One of the lessons in the curriculum is titled "To Die For," a title I might note that echoes Erickson's observation about youth identity. And it encourages students to think about situations where they, like the Anabaptist martyrs, would risk their status by standing up for their convictions. In fact, one of the suggested activities for students is asking them to complete this sentence: I could see myself making difficult choices because my belief in ... An open-ended question that connects well to this particular image in Martyrs Mirror, the one of Simon the shopkeeper refusing to bow down to a communion procession as the host passes by. And you can see there he's being encouraged by others to just take a knee like they are, but he stands. Obviously, the pressure to bow down to a communion procession won't resonate with most North American youth. But the courage to stand up for one's conviction, in Simon's case, literally standing up, is an act of courage that resonates in almost every age. At least it does in 21st century Philadelphia, where a Mennonite youth leader and hip-hop artist, Cruz Cordero, has created a rap based on Martyrs Mirror in order to introduce urban youth to the possibilities of nonviolence. In Cordero's neighborhood, where violence is never far away, offering nonviolence as an alternative and suggesting that it's a courageous path to take is indeed an invitation to oddity. I can't attest to the effectiveness of his endeavor, which is no doubt swimming against the tide. The best I can do on the positive side of the ledger is provide one anecdote of a recent Mennonite college student who during her high school years in a Mennonite church played a game called Persecution with her Northern Indiana youth group. And I just grabbed this image off the internet to help your imagination. It's not really the youth group. But in this game, a team of Anabaptist catchers chases around a team of Anabaptists, trying to hit them with eggs and flour as a stand-in for late medieval torture. When I first read about this game in the course of my research, it reaffirmed in my mind that I would be a terrible youth minister. And to be quite honest, this young woman, at least in retrospect, wasn't all that impressed. Admitting how ludicrous it is to call this game filled with squeals of laughter, persecution. This recognition, however, did not dim her appreciation for what her youth leaders were trying to do. In her words, the game, complemented with a more serious consideration of the Anabaptist martyrs, helped remind her that, quote, following Jesus has traditionally set Anabaptists at odds with their neighbors, unquote, particularly in terms of their rejection of violence. This willingness to, quote, be radical is what she wanted to claim for herself. Quote, to put away the sword is often seen as crazy, unquote, in 21st century America, and it often invites scorn. Still, she said, if the Anabaptist martyrs could reject the sword in their circumstances, maybe she could too. In that regard, this 21st century Mennonite teenager, a young woman who played on her high school soccer team, dressed like other American teens, and fretted about the opinions of her non-Mennonite friends, this teenager found in Martyrs Mirror exactly what the Mennonite ministers north of Philadelphia hoped their children would find in the 1740s. For her, Martyrs Mirror proved to be a valuable resource for buttressing her non-resistant faith. It proved to be a stepping stone to an Anabaptist future. Martyrs Mirror invited her to oddity, or at least confirmed to her that she wasn't standing alone in that oddness. And at least for her, that was enough for her to remain true to the faith of her father and her mother, if not until death, at least for another day. So, thank you for listening to me this evening. I am eager to hear if you have questions that I probably can't answer. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. That was fascinating. I'm wondering if you can comment on one Martyrs Mirror image, which is the most well-known, which is the one of Dirk Willems crossing the guard crossing the ice. And at least in my senses, that's the image that is most well-known amongst contemporary Mennonites and most used in a teaching sense. I mean, I don't know all the images, obviously, in the book, but is one of the least violent.
Right.
There's no torture in there.
Right.
And how is that used?
Yeah. In my book, I have a whole chapter on Dirk, because it is. It's the one that has survived and the one that's been used, and I think rightly, we understand why. You know, it is the one, not only that's not violent. I mean, there are a couple other images that aren't violent, but it's one where the Anabaptist has the power to be taking an activist approach with his faith. And so he's not just at the mercy of others, but has a possibility of activism. Yeah, no, that is definitely the one that continues to be used the most. It shows up in Sunday school curricula. This curricula I talked about, it would show up there. Its image, at least the Mennonite schools that I'm familiar with, it's there. From what I understand, Mennonite educators use that image. I think that image also raises questions. I mean, I think sometimes it's been used in ways that it just is very clear that Dirk is the hero and he's the person that we should imitate. And certainly in these conservative groups where I've read their literature, participated in listening in on the kinds of teaching they do, that is the story of Dirk. Dirk is the hero. There's no question Dirk is the hero and he's doing what should be done. At least in some more assimilated Mennonite circles, it's an image that is to at least be questioned. Dirk could have kept going. There are people standing at the side that are watching what's going on. Why didn't Dirk let them do the rescue? And so I do think that in teenage settings, in more assimilated congregations, those sort of questions arise about the ultimate sacrifice. And there have been wonderful literary presentations about Dirk's decision to do that. Means that he's leaving, and it's imaginative, leaving a family behind without a father. So there have been some wonderfully imaginative sort of takes on that. But again, I think in assimilated Mennonite circles, some of those questions end up being raised in teaching settings that don't get raised in more conservative settings where Dirk is clearly the hero and someone to be imitated.
What would you comment on the idea that this is a record of one group of Christians persecuting another group of Christians? Does that make it more difficult for our society to even, I guess, grasp that this would happen?
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about particularly using it with teens, or are you talking about just the possibility of raising that question?
This book is a record of one group of Christians persecuting another group of Christians over, I guess, doctrinal issues, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, no, exactly right. I mean, I don't find that to be a hard issue to raise in environments where I am, to raise that and to use that, especially when we think about persecution in the world today, that this has been around a long time, and many of these years it's been Christians persecuting other Christians. I think where the difficulty arises is when in the 21st century we're interested in fostering ecumenical relations with Christians who are different from us. How are these stories being used, and how that can continue to keep Christian groups apart when we recall this sort of past. So in those sort of settings, I think it becomes very complicated to know how to talk about these stories and how to use them. But, you know, I'm only speaking for myself in the kind of history courses I teach to college students who aren't much older than some of these students or teenagers we've been talking about. I find that to be an important point for them to consider and recognize when that may not be something that they're familiar with whatsoever. I mean, did you want to say more about the difficulty?
Well, I guess what I was asking is, in your college class, when you teach this, that would have, like, don't they say this almost doesn't make any sense to them? Has this ever happened?
Well, I mean, I think what doesn't often make sense in terms of college students I'm speaking to, what doesn't often make sense is that these particular doctrines are worth killing people over or worth dying for. Okay. So, adult baptism, it seems like a better thing than infant baptism. But am I going to die for adult baptism? Infant baptism seems like a pretty decent idea. So I think that's the question that's raised. That the doctrinal issues at stake don't seem to be worth killing for or dying for. But that just, I think, reminds us that the past is a foreign country and they don't do things there, like we do here. There's something very past about the past, and that's what I need to help my students think about.
I find your reflection very interesting in terms of a context where we're now dealing with a lot more adolescent anxiety. And it reminds me of some of what we rail against from my generation, at least those of us that were exposed to more of a fear-based theology. And that would have included stories of the Martyrs Mirror as well as more hellfire and brimstone. So I'd be curious if there's been any research done with these groups that are still teaching the Martyrs Mirror as part of the encouragement to youth to claim the faith, to have something to anchor, whether those groups of youth are dealing with less anxiety than the youth in our other Mennonite congregations.
Yeah, I don't know a good study to cite. My sense, just in what I know about older Amish, some of the issues related to youth. I mean, I know anxiety is often a way that we talk about it now. You don't hear quite as much about eating disorders, but that's a bit. I mean, those sort of eating disorders I know are very absent in Amish communities. I think if I were to guess, the kinds of anxiety issues that we're dealing with contemporary, assimilated, modern kids, is you just don't see that to the same degree in conservative Amish Mennonite communities. Now, that obviously stems from a whole host of cultural factors and the kind of context that they're growing up in. And I would also say that the children in those communities that do have those issues often don't get the kind of help that they need. So, I mean, that's the other issue there. But, yeah, I just don't think that those sort of anxiety issues are nearly the way they are in our society because of social media. I mean, just all kinds of reasons that are compounding anxiety for our younger teens.
Well, I think it reflects the fact that what we're not doing in the church anymore is also part of what's happening in parenting. I mean, there's been some good research around that we're keeping kids safe, too safe for their own good. Sometimes is the language.
Yeah.
And there's a parallel to that, I think, in how we safeguard theology too.
Well, let me read that. This is from a youth ministry. I am not an expert in youth ministry, but I was interested. I quoted Kenda Creasy-Dean and her thinking about passion and youth interest in martyrdom. This is from a book entitled "You Lost Me: Why Young Christians Are Leaving the Church," by David Kinnaman, who's a researcher, part of the Barna Group. And he has a whole chapter called "Overprotective," which is interesting. And a whole chapter on overprotective. And so this is what he writes. An overprotected generation has been sold the lie that, quote, Christian living means material blessing, automatic protection, and bulletproof safety. 2 millennia of Christian martyrs beg to differ, and many young adults today are interested in those martyrs' lives of jeopardy and fulfillment. They are desperate for a new way to understand and experience the worthy risks of following Christ. So anyway, I was just interested in his writing on that, interviewing hundreds of teenagers, asking them, why have you stayed with church or why have you left? That's at least one chapter he has. Now, I criticized the Sunday school teacher that used the shock and awe that Stephanie Grebel writes about. Sunday school teachers, all teachers have challenges. You've got 10, 12, 30 students in there. You don't know what's going on in their head. You don't know what's going to be helpful to this student and hurtful to another. That is the challenge of teaching. And so while I'm sympathetic to what David Kinnaman says here about overprotecting people, I'm not sympathetic with the teacher going in there and showing all these torture images. So that's the rub. It's a good question.
I'm curious, as you looked at the pedagogical uses of the Martyrs Mirror, a lot of them seem to be along the lines of, what inspired these martyrs? Could we be like them in our own way? How can we live that out? But of course, there's a whole other set of characters in those stories that we might see ourselves in as well. And of course, assimilated Mennonites in particular are very much, in some cases, in positions of privilege in society, and maybe in some, all of us in some ways maybe perpetuate oppression that we don't always see. So do you see any sort of move towards see, using the Martyrs Mirror, also to see ourselves in the persecutors and as maybe warnings and cautionary tales?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't seen that, where it's turned, at least for teenagers. I mean, there's been plenty of writing about that, more geared toward adults. But in terms of teenagers, I haven't seen that sort of thing where privileged teens are being asked about, are you the persecutor? There are questions in some of the curriculum that ask questions like this. What do you think the persecutors were feeling as they were doing this? Do you think the persecutors were, quote, good people? Good people just doing what they were told to do. So there is that sort of reversal, that we're not just in the Sunday school class or the school classroom to identify with the martyrs, but also to try to get into the skin of the persecutors. Not quite to the extent that you raised, but at least to begin to identify them as other important characters, other human beings here that don't come off, very good in von Braut's rendering of them, but how can we sympathize with them as human beings who are caught in this web of violence as well.
David, thanks for your lecture. I would encourage folks to buy the book.
Amen. It's the best question so far.
I thought you'd like that. What I found interesting about it was sort of the publication history of how it came to be and how it came to be in so many homes. I recall a visit we had here from a school group in the archives that came from Cedar Peel Public School, but it was a school populated with a lot of old colony Mennonites, conservative Mennonites. And Lorene showed them a Martyrs Mirror, and she asked, how many of you have this in your home? And all of their hands went up. And they all knew what it was, and it just sort of struck me that that's a lot of sales when you think about the publication history. But it's interesting the way that it's been inculcated into those conservative Mennonite homes in a way that it's just not in assimilated families.
Right, and I find it given frequently as a wedding gift, which, we can make all kinds of jokes about that, right? Martyrs Mirror, martyrdom, getting married, all the jokes that can easily come to mind. But I do think that, it's seen as you are now entering into creating a family yourself. You as a family need to have this book. And so I find it as a wedding gift from parents to the next generation when they reach that age. Now, there are an awful lot of Amish voices in my research and in my conversations that say it's a shelf book. We don't read it. It's not a book that, and it's a hard book to read, and I think even some Amish parents wonder, is this appropriate reading for children or youth? But to say something is a shelf book is usually a way that we diminish it, but the books you have on your shelf say something about you and your family, so that it's a shelf book is also important.
The society in which these stories arose are not democracies. Theocracies, perhaps, is the right word. Quite different from our Western democracies where we value diversity, accept differences, and so forth. How is it possible to make use of a book like that in our setting?
Yeah, that's the question that I think assimilated Mennonites wrestle with. Is there enough connection here? Different people, different groups would answer that differently. I mean, some people would say that this is a book that says something important about our history, and that to recognize it as an important part of our history is how we should think about it. Others would say it's an important part of our history, but we are connected to other Christians in other parts of the world that are experiencing this suffering today. So that's another step that some people would want to make. too often, I think, in America, in the United States at least, then the turn is, and we are really under threat ourselves as Christians in America. I'm not ready to make that turn, but I do think you can make the turn about all Christians have pressures that they feel that it's easy to abandon what they would say are commitments. So I think that's, again, a turn that you can make, and various groups are going to make that turn differently, I think. There's a question back there. Got her hand up.
I think we'll make this the last question.
You mentioned that assimilated churches are growing in their reluctance to use the Martyrs Mirror. In your answer for the last question, you briefly touched on globalization of the church and other cultures. But what role do you think that different cultures and assimilated churches in North America and converts play in the reluctance to use the Martyrs Mirror, if any?
Can you say that again? What role do...
You think the existence of like converts and different cultures coming to Mennonite assimilated churches play in the reluctance in North America, at least, to use the Martyrs Mirror, if any role?
Yeah, I'm not sure that that's played a huge role. I mean, I think the reluctance to use it has more to do with maybe the previous question, that our own environment is so different from that one. They're fighting or disagreeing over issues that aren't important to us. So I think that reluctance, in a certain sense, precedes a growing ethnic diversity among Mennonites who, don't trace roots back to Europe. At the same time, I think that makes it even more complicated to know what to do with this book. I played a lot in my talk about faith of our fathers, faith of our mothers, and it is hard for many Mennonites to not put a very kind of biological spin on that. We're talking about, when we look at the martyrs, it's literally our blood that is flowing because these are people who I have in my past. And I think that sort of thinking, I think has been appropriately mollified to some degree when people recognize that the growing parts of the Mennonite church, both globally and in North America, are not ethnic Mennonites. So again, I think that the reluctance precedes that recognition, but I think that recognition has reinforced this problem of how do we use this book. And people have given thought to that. I mean, there are kind of new martyrologies that both use these 16th century Anabaptists and then put other people, other Christians from other ethnic, other racial communities into the book. So that's one way the story is expanded in some settings. But again, I think using Martyrs Mirror itself has a bit harder. Good question.
Please join me once more in thanking David for Bloody Theater is a folk art storytelling collaboration of Dan Root and Meg Harder. Meg is a visual artist whose work draws on fraktur and illustrative Mennonite folk art. Dan is a musician and songwriter with Kitchener-based duo Quiet in the Land. The Bloody Theater is Meg and Dan's first creative collaboration. The project, which will be performed at the Brubaker House Museum in Waterloo, features 3 original folk songs accompanied by live projected illustrations. Each song retells a selected story from Martyrs Mirror, with music inspired by Mennonite hymnals and illustrations crafted in the fraktur folk art tradition. The performance, which has been generously supported by the Region of Waterloo Arts Fund, will also include readings by local writers Dylan Siebert, and Seth Ratzlaff with Clarence Kakagi. Tonight, as a preview for this event, Dan Root will perform The Damnation of Judge Louis. Or Louis? Louis? Whatever. Which can be seen with full accompanying illustrations at the Bloody Theatre performance on Friday, March 23rd. Dan?
Hello, check. So just before I start the song, I just wanted to say 3 things. First of all, thank you to the organizers of the event for having us. And if you're interested in what we're doing, Meg and I will be at a table in the atrium afterwards, so you can come talk to us and pick up a ticket if you'd like. The other 2 things are related to this particular song. As you mentioned, each song tells a story from the Martyrs Mirror. This song is not about any particular martyrs. It's actually about a particularly enthusiastic persecutor of some Anabaptists named Judge Louis. I assume it's Louis, I've only read it, so. And the tune, each song tries to incorporate a tune that has some connections to the Mennonite hymnals, and so this one you might recognize, it's actually a Welsh tune, and it's used in the Green Hymnal. So without further ado, this is The Damnation of Judge Louis. We heard the news with cold despair, 5 of our own in Zion Square, and of a church residing there, who hauled the wood and lit the flare. We gathered there our faith to share, and raise to God a somber prayer, that loving faith should never fail, and wicked men should not prevail. Then we cried aloud to the host of heaven, the God of Abraham, down to the raging clouds to relieve the suffering of your children. Does it make you proud? Does it make you proud to see the wicked and unrighteous rule your realm? Where justice now is not in you, our God, for it's nowhere to be found among all the kings of earth who so abuse the lowly crowd. The judge rode out to slay and sin, to where we gathered safe within his wicked crowd. He aimed to fill with blood of innocence to spill. not ignore. God smote the judge upon the floor. Then we cried aloud to the hosts of heaven, and the God of Abraham come down to the raging clouds to relieve the suffering of your children. Does it make you proud? Does it make you proud to see the wicked and unrighteous rule your realm? There's justice now, it's not in you, O God of ages. As the judge lay down in his robe so proud, though attended soundly by his kin, he could not be roused.